Good morning. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the elders for giving me this opportunity to speak before you today. It has challenged me in ways that I haven't been challenged before, and I'm truly grateful for this opportunity to speak before you today. As I get into what I want to talk about today, I want all of us just to close our eyes for a quick second and imagine. Imagine the sun scorching down on you. Oh, you don't actually have to imagine that because it's what we live in every day. But I think that we can all agree that Arizona would be a lot harder to deal with if it wasn't for ACs, of which thermostats can control. If it wasn't for those fine systems, we'd be stuck with our digital thermometer telling us how hot it is outside, and we'd have no way of controlling it. And wearing a suit and tie would be a whole lot more miserable to wear than it is right now inside of a nice room. So that's what I want to talk about today, the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat, and what it means to be each of these instruments in our daily lives. Before I begin, I want to briefly highlight the differences between the two systems as it will set out my points later on. Starting with the thermometer. A thermometer measures and reflects the temperature of its surroundings. It reacts to what is already present, showing the current state of the environment without altering it. If the environment is hot, the thermometer will show that it is hot. If it is cold, it shows a low temperature. Essentially, a thermometer is passive. It merely observes and reflects. In contrast, a thermostat actively controls and adjusts the temperature. It doesn't just measure it, but it takes action to influence the environment. If the room is too cold, the thermostat turns the heater on. And if it's too hot, we all know that it's going to make it cooler. A thermostat is proactive. It sets the condition it aims for, rather than just responding to the existing state. In quick summary of the differences between the two, a thermometer reflects the environment, whereas a thermostat controls the environment. So I want to talk about the powerful concept of being a thermostat rather than a thermometer. This analogy helps us to understand how we can influence our environment rather than simply reacting to it. To delve into this concept, we'll explore a couple of scriptures and consider biblical examples that illustrates this approach to life. Let's first start out by opening our Bibles and going to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, verse 2, it reads, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." In this verse, we are urged not to conform to the patterns and the pressures of the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. This renewal allows us to influence the world around us, acting as a thermostat that sets the temperature in our daily environment rather than being a thermometer which would conform and reflect the world's environment. Now let's turn to John, the 17th chapter. John chapter 17, and we'll start in verse 15. It reads, "I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world." This concept that we are very familiar with of being of the world and in the world is very similar to being a thermostat and not a thermometer. Someone who is living a lifestyle of merely reflecting the culture around them is living of the world, instead of someone who breaks the status quo and is a temperature changer is someone who lives that thermostat lifestyle lives in the world. Now that we've looked at what being a thermostat looks like, let's consider some biblical examples to illustrate how to embody this thermostat lifestyle rather than one of a thermometer. And the first example is of David. I'm going to 1 Samuel chapter 17 to the infamous story of David and Goliath. 1 Samuel 17. As we look at this story in 1 Samuel chapter 17, let's first look at verse 11 to first understand the temperature of the situation before David even gets involved. 1 Samuel 17, starting in verse 11, it reads, "When Saul and all of Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." Clearly mentioned, the mood was very doom and gloom, not just amongst Saul, but everybody, amongst the entire Israelites. Now, we aren't fighting a giant man who would tower over all of us, but I think that same fear can be found in today's society, where the mood of the people is fearful and afraid of what could be. Whether they're afraid of what happens in November, whether they're afraid of the next military move across the world, whether they're afraid of rising prices, fear of you name it. Not only were they fearful, but as we look at verse 16, it says, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening." And if we drop down to verse 24, "And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid." And it continues with what Saul tells David in verse 33. "And Saul said to David, 'You are not going to be able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth.'" Obviously, we know that this did not stop David, as we see in verse 37. "Moreover, David said, 'The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of a lion and from the paw of a bear, he will deliver me the hand of this Philistine.'" David faced Goliath not as a mere observer of the overwhelming odds, but as someone who set the tone with his unwavering faith in the Lord. Despite the fear and discouragement that plagued not only his king, but the entire nation of Israel, David's faith and confidence in God transformed the battle from one of despair to one of victory. He did not reflect the fear of those around him, but instead set a precedent of courage and trust in God's power. And we should take this as a lesson that we are to provide hope even when there seems to be no hope within the world. Next, I want to go to Mark 14. Mark chapter 14. Mark 14, I'll be starting in verse 3. "And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, 'Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.' And they scolded her. But Jesus said, 'Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me.'" As we can tell, the mood is very critical of her actions. They asked amongst themselves, why was she so wasteful? Once again, I think this is very similar to stuff that we see in today society, mainly concerning our time. I think that we've all been told by someone at some point that what we do by going to worship services is a waste of our time. I've heard the classic, Drew, you can't hang out tonight because you got Bible class again. Man, you're just wasting your time with all that. But I ask, can we rise above that criticism and realize that it isn't wasteful what we're doing here? Instead, be a thermostat and change the temperature by doing what others aren't and is considered wasteful to them? Because if we look again at verse 6, let's look at what Jesus says again about her actions. "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me." A beautiful thing. This should inspire us. We should take joy in the fact that when we're doing the Lord's work, even if we are being criticized, that it is deemed as a beautiful thing. Let us never take to heart what the world says, but rather change the temperature and be different than everyone else, knowing that we are doing a beautiful work for the kingdom. For the third and final example of a thermostat, let's turn to Genesis 26. Genesis 26. We're going to look at Isaac. Genesis 26, and if we look at verse 1, we'll see that there's a famine in the land. And starting in verse 2, it reads, "And the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws.' So Isaac settled in Gerar." Isaac chose to stay in the land of famine and sow seeds. And as we drop down to verse 12, it says, "Then Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. And the Lord blessed him." Instead of conforming to the natural expectations of scarcity, Isaac's faith and obedience resulted in remarkable abundance. His actions set a new standard, proving that faithfulness and obedience to God's direction can transcend natural limitations. So I ask you, are you willing to trust in the Lord even when it seems unreasonable? Even when it seems that the odds are stacked against you? Even when it seems foolish to the outside world? I hope we can take inspiration from David, the woman in Mark 14, and Isaac, that being a thermostat means actively influencing our surroundings with our faith, values, and actions. By doing so, we transform environments rather than merely reflecting them. Now that we've looked at what it looks like to be a thermostat, and we've seen 3 examples of a thermostat, let's explore how shaping our environment according to our values and beliefs applies to some areas in our lives. First, with school. Kids, instead of simply reacting to academic pressures and peer influences, we can set a standard for diligence, integrity, and kindness. By doing so, we create an atmosphere where excellence and respect thrive. Kids, again, in our sports, can we lead by example, and instead of conforming to the world and skipping a worship service to attend a practice, play in a game, or watch film with the team, can we have the courage to defend our faith and put it above our athletic desires? Instead of involving ourselves in sinful social settings, we can influence the tone of our environment by embodying principles of modesty, respect, and good judgment rather than being swayed by the crowd and participating in immoral behaviors that don't let us let our light shine. In a culture that often promotes self-exposure, we can set a new standard by choosing attire that reflects our values of respect and self-worth. By using words to uplift and encourage rather than to curse, criticize, or demean, we can set a positive tone in our interactions and communications with others. And lastly, with our character. We can shape our character and actions in alignment with biblical principles impacting those around us by being a model of integrity and kindness. Now, I'd be lying to you to say that at no point in our lives can we be a thermometer. In fact, it would actually contradict Scripture. So let's quickly dive into when we should be a thermometer. I'm going to go pretty rapid fire on these verses, so I'm just going to throw them up on the screen so you don't have to frantically flip through your Bible. The first one being Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1. Therefore, be imitators of God as dear children. Next, in 1 Peter 2, verse 21, it reads, "For this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, that you should follow his steps." 1 Corinthians 11:1 reads, "Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ." And finally, to drive the point home, in 1 John 2, verse 6, it says, He who says he abides in him ought himself to walk just as he walked. There's not a whole lot else I can say because the verses speak for themselves pretty clearly on the matter. We aren't here to walk on this earth to imitate the worldly sins, but rather to imitate the perfect example we have, which is Christ. But I'll come clean and admit I've been withholding one important piece of information from all of you, and that's the fact that thermostats actually have a thermometer built into their system. Inside each of those electronic thermostats that you'll see on the wall right there and right there is a smart device that diagnoses the current temperature, so when a user sets the temperature to a certain level, that internal thermometer registers whether or not to heat or cool the room. This application is that anyone who attempts to influence a group of people should first read the room before they try to lead the room. Read the room before you lead the room. A great illustration of this was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream speech to 250,000 people at the Washington Mall, where I myself recently visited and stood in the very place that he stood. Hope you like my shoes in the right picture. And then don't mind the construction that's being done on the left side of the left picture. The manuscript with him that he carried to the podium took 11 minutes to deliver. At that moment, and in response to singer Mahalia Jackson's request to tell them about the dream, Martin, he pushed aside his notes and he spoke from the heart. And for the next 6.5 minutes, he offered the stirring words that we have now recalled for the last 61 years and is debatably regarded as the most influential speech of the 20th century. All because some add-on language from a speaker who knew how to be a good thermometer by taking an important piece of input and then giving the hearers his thermostat moment. Leaders don't need a title. Leaders don't need an assigned position. Leaders don't need a badge to influence others. Genuine leaders influence people by understanding the current temperature among a group and responding accordingly. They observe when a community is cool and needs to be heated up with passion. They also see when a group is hot and a calming presence is the one that's needed. To be effective thermostats, we must first be good thermometers. To close this out, let's turn to 1 Corinthians 12. I'll make a few comments and the lesson will be yours. 1 Corinthians 12. First Corinthians 12. First, let's start in verse 2. You know that you were Gentiles, carried away to these dumb idols, however you were led. What we first notice is that they started out as thermometers and were led astray and worshipped idols, but we quickly realized that they had to dial the thermostat to a temperature according to the scriptures, which allowed them to continue on the straight and narrow path. But now let's drop down to verse 12. For as the body is one and has many members, but all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and have all been made to drink into one Spirit. For in fact, the body is not one member, but many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear should say, Because I am not an eye, I am not of the body. Is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where would be the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where would be the smelling? But now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as he pleased. And if they were all one member, where would the body be? But now indeed, there are many members, yet one body. And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. No, much rather, those members of the body which seem to be weaker are necessary, and those members of the body which we think to be less honorable, on those we bestow greater honor. And our unpresentable parts have greater modesty, but our presentable parts have no need. But God composed the body, having given greater honor to the part which lacks it, that there should be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care for one another. And if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. Or if one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and members individually. And God has appointed these in the church: first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healing, helps, administrations, varieties of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Are all workers of miracles? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I show you a more excellent way. So I ask you guys, are all of us elders? Are all of us deacons? Are all of us Bible class teachers? We all know the answer to that is no. So I'm going to reiterate some of the things stated in those verses that I just read and substitute them for leadership roles in the church to drive my point home. If a member should say, because I am not an elder, I am not of the body, is it therefore not a part of the body? And the elders cannot say to a work group leader, I have no need of you. Nor can the Bible class teacher tell the members, I have no need of you. No, much rather, these members which seem to be weaker are necessary. And those members which we think to be less honorable, on these we bestow greater honor. Leadership within the church does not require you to hold a position. The Lord will not tell you that you can't enter in because you were never a deacon. And I assure you, you won't read anywhere in the Bible that because you don't have a leadership position that you can't shine your light so that others may see your good works. If we truly want to be as effective in the Lord's work, we need to understand that each body part has a function and we work together as one body. We are a house built on a rock that cannot be moved, regardless of how hard the devil is trying to work to tip the house over. So I ask one final question. Are you part of the body that's talked about in 1 Corinthians 12? Have you been baptized for the remission of your sins? Or if you have been baptized, have you been living the life that you need to live? Or do you need to be a thermostat and take control again of your life by repenting of those sins? Whatever your needs may be, I urge you that you become a thermostat and take control of the temperature and set it back to the way that you know is right, which is based on the Word, by coming forward while we stand and while we sing.